Hey guys, welcome back from the break. Actually, we have the last session about China with Fernando, and we're going to talk about COVID-19. We just finished talking about human rights, and actually, these two things come together very naturally, right, Fernando? I mean, transitioning from human rights to COVID-19. How does
They
it?
do. They do, because one large aspect that we did not mention in the previous section, because I wanted to lay the grounds for speaking about it now, is to talk about how China has been using their how Western societies have used China's stance about human rights against China, and how China has fought back and has tried to reshape international relationships to best favor their outcomes, the outcomes they desire. As we mentioned in the previous class, when we were talking about the pillars of China's international policies and China's even national policy, we talked about how China values almost above everything else non-interventionism, to be left alone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they have largely used every criticism towards the stance about human rights. They've used it as an argument toward that. They said, no, you cannot criticize how I manage my affairs, because they are my affairs. I do things however I see fit. To the point that they have been interfering in other countries' affairs to ensure that nobody interferes with their affairs.
Mm-hmm.
Let me explain again. Basically, whenever a country has tried to push China on their human rights abuses, they have always pushed back. They have always criticized. They have tried to undermine this country. This has happened with Sweden, with the Nobel Rights, with the Nobel Prizes. This has happened with Canada, with which they have clashed many times. This has happened with the United States. This has happened with the European Union when they were stronger. They had a stronger stance. Basically, until the 90s, United States and the EU were trying to come down to China with because of their human rights track record, and China would always scream, "Do not interfere in my affairs." Now, when China did gain the economic power, the economic traction that they have now, they started using this power to threaten countries who would try to call them out on these human rights abuses, as it has happened in many instances. Whenever the European Union tried to call them out in regard, they will threaten to enforce sanctions, to make things more difficult. And this is even easier to observe nowadays with the COVID, and that is why we were trying to talk about this now that we're going to talk about COVID.
So how does it relate? Because I mean, when the outbreak took place in China, what happened then?
So China was not living its best moment in 2019. China was being called out because of the conflict with Hong Kong, that China was not clearly winning. China had been using a lot of their economic might to bring Hong Kong to its knees, and had achieved to do so, but Hong Kong society was not budging. They were still demonstrating, they were still protesting, they were willing to shot themselves in the knee, as China had put it, in order to ensure that China would not meddle in their affairs. At the same time, China was being under the spotlight because of treatment of Uyghur minorities. Larger segments of the population outside of China were being made aware of the abuses that were happening in the Uyghur provinces. It had failed to dominate the news as much as Chinese Communist Party proponents would want it to, but it was still it was still dominating the international relationships of China at the time, the way China was being talked about at the time. So under these circumstances, the outbreak happens. This is October 2019, and basically, quickly, it is brought to the attention of people that there is a new type of virus going on in Wuhan province, and that it has the potential of being a crisis. Now, at the beginning, this crisis is not taken serious. Why? Because China had undergone the SARS crisis and the poultry fever. They had gone over a couple of pneumonias in which nothing major happened. They did suffer some losses at the time, and it did change the way that China reacted about those crises. Before 2004, they didn't even have a Center for Disease Control, as the United States have. After that first SARS crisis, they did create a Center for Disease Control. They did create the policies to try to contain any such problem. But because they were undergoing several political crises of their own, the Chinese government did not have the time or the interest of getting into a full control of the situation. One of the main problems for China is how everything is very top-down. This top-down approach leaves China very slow to react in some instances. When they do react, it's very effective. Whenever the top gets a hold of a situation, everything gets solved relatively quickly. But at the beginning, it did take a long time for China to react. And even more importantly, when they started to react, they reacted to try to cover it up. Basically, the mindset was like, we have enough things going on. We don't need this silly fear-mongering among doctors in Wuhan saying that there's a crisis happening. So they silenced it. And they silenced it, even jailing some doctors who were raising concerns and speaking to the media, as China does not tolerate that type of
criticism.
They are basically, as we spoke in previous classes, China is very concerned, very aware of how things ended up in Russia. So for them to project certain image towards the national audiences and international audiences is key. They do understand that this is key for them to keep in power, and therefore their first reactions were towards this goal, where it's like, we need to save face, we need to maintain a facade of being under control. So this is how things got such out of control.
And from there we move to another phase when actually things and people realize that things are out of control, right?
Exactly. Basically, their top-down approach was not working, and things on the ground were getting more and more out of control, and then the central government was forced to act. Again, we can call out China in about of things that they did wrong at the beginning, but they also did things right when they did get a hold of the situation and how bad things could get, which was towards January, when we were approaching the lunar New Year in February. It is then that China realized that if left unchecked, things could get very, very crazy. And they react in a manner that we are familiar with now, but we weren't previously. How the full lockdowns, forbidding people to travel from one province to another, from one city to another, forbidding people to go to work. They quickly move. They quickly contact software companies, mobile phone companies, allowing for their full monitorization and check on citizens on the ground. They enforce a plethora of measures that were at the time looked in amazement from outside of China, saying this is only a Chinese thing. No one else could do this thing. This is crazy. This is undemocratic. But also people understood that that was necessary, even from the beginning. In outside of China, people saying, yeah, that's what it should have happened. And
yeah,
this ends up being the correct goal. It took them a little bit to do it, but it ends up being the correct call. And because they took it before anyone else, this has allowed the Chinese government to try and shape the way that China is perceived under this crisis. At the beginning, when things start getting out of control in Europe and the United States, there's a lot of Chinese fear mongering, racism, and name calling towards the China. This is the China virus, as many of you are familiar. Some world leaders are trying to push the narrative of a Chinese virus, of a Chinese problem, even calling for China to do restorations. That's how crazy things got at the beginning.
And now China is kind of turning around.
Exactly, and China quickly turned it around. So China does realize that they have an image problem because of this situation, but because they took such an effective control when they finally decided to step on the problem, they are being called by many people outside of China as the correct agents, like the model that needs to be imitated when dealing with this crisis. This could be this, of course, is arguably wrong, because as I said at the beginning, everybody thought that the measures that are underway in United States, Europe, and almost every country in the world were exclusively Chinese. They could not be imitated anywhere else in the world. And we are sadly seeing that this is not the case, that these are in fact necessary measures. And so China is now trying to shape the international discourse by exerting soft power, sending heaps and heaps of help, despite I mean, it's worth noting that a lot of this is being sold, not sent as help. It's actually they are purchases. They are selling equipment. They're selling sanitary equipment. They're not sending gifts. They're sending
international aid is actually trade.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that despite a lot of transparency in a lot of measures that China took, like the lockdown, mobile phone control, etc., there's a lot of things that are not so transparent. The number of diseases, the number of doctors and healthcare professionals who are getting the virus or who got the virus during the crisis, those things were not communicated in a timely manner, or they haven't been communicated, period, to the World Health Organization and to other countries affected, which has severely impaired the reaction of other countries. In Spain, we have crazy numbers of healthcare professionals getting the virus, and we still don't, it's north of, and in China, we do not know how many healthcare professionals are among those affected. Yeah. Namely, in China, in Wuhan, there were only 2,300 victims of COVID. However, it is a widely shared number in China that there were over 40,000 urns sent to Wuhan at the peak of the crisis.
Wow.
So right now there are a lot of pundits and China experts talking about over 4,000 victims in Wuhan alone.
You said 40,000.
40,000. Wow. Yeah. Yes, okay. That's one of the numbers shared. There are other numbers going around talking about how there's millions of less users of phone services and internet services, but this is also, it is also widely known that the typical Chinese citizen would have 2 or 3 SIM cards. So it is normal that during a crisis they would get rid of 1 or 2 of those SIM cards because they are not necessary. What I mean to say is that right now, what we know is that we are not getting the full story on China, that China is working very, very hard to shape the conversation outside of China, coming up with different statements for similar problems, depending on what answer they think that the world wants to hear. And when all is said and done, we're going to have to see what the perception of China is right now. Yeah. Overall, I would say that they have managed to come up on top. But I could also say that there's growing racism against foreigners in China now, because now foreigners are the carriers of. Exactly. It has come all the way around in China. There are shops not allowing for foreigners to go shop in. There are there's a ban on foreigners traveling to China.
Yeah.
And so what I would like to highlight is how China is struggling to come up on top in the international on the way Western society or international community is perceiving how they manage the crisis. And while they did take a lot of correct calls, they did make a lot of wrong calls, and the lack of transparency is quickly becoming a problem.
Yeah.
And the right take on all of this is that China needs more transparency, not less. That the world needs more transparency, more communication, not less. So whomever does go around advocating Chinese-style measures would actually be condemning us to more debts and more mismanagement, because we wouldn't know the full story.
Yeah. Well, Fernando, I mean, that's fantastic, actually. It's quite interesting how all of these 4 topics relate to each other. I hope that these have actually, you found it as interesting as I absolutely did. I have to thank you, Fernando, for coming and helping and telling it so much about China. And yeah, I mean, guys, if you have any questions, you can email me, or you can actually email Fernando. But this is the time we have. It's been an absolute pleasure, Fernando. Thank you so much. And for you guys, I'll see you actually in a week and a half in class. Remember, the next week is holidays, is Semana Santa. We'll be confined, but hopefully we can enjoy it as much as possible. Thank you so much once again, Fernando, and see you later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.